All right. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Emily Lyons. I want to welcome everybody today. I am the chair of the Democrats Abroad Global Asian American and Pacific Islander Caucus. For those of you that are attending your first event with our caucus, we are one of the newer caucuses in Democrats Abroad. There is a newer one now, but we were officially established last June. And if you're not a member yet, everyone is welcome to join. Even if you don't identify as AAPI, all are welcome. You could easily become a member. You just go to democratsabroad.org/AAPI, and then you can sign up. Jumping straight into our topic today, we will be talking about AAPI voter participation and trends, things like that. So just to start with a short introduction, according to the Pew Research Center, the US Asian population is projected to reach 46 million by 2060. And based on the recent US Census, Asians are now the fastest growing of the nation's four largest racial and ethnic groups. The 2020 election did show us all what kind of impact the AAPI vote can have. Among eligible Asian American voters, voter turnout was just under 60%, which was actually a significant increase from the 49% turnout in 2016. And among Pacific Islanders, turnout also grew significantly, which went from 41% to almost 58% between 2016 and 2020. During the Georgia runoffs, both the Warnock and Ossoff campaigns included leaders in their campaign focused on outreach to the AAPI community. And so as we gear up for 2022, our caucus is really interested in finding ways to get out the vote among the AAPI community living overseas. Our goal of reaching more AAPI voters is exactly the reason that inspired today's event. I first want to thank our steering committee member, Susan Takao in Australia, for helping to make this event happen. And I also now want to introduce our speaker today, Christine Chen. Christine moved to Washington, D.C. from Ohio and first took on organizing and leadership roles at the Organization for Chinese Americans. During her time as executive director of OCA National from 2001 to 2006, Christine was a member of the executive committee of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a founding member of APIA Scholars, and served on numerous boards, including the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans and Demos Board of Trustees. She currently is serving on the Kennedy Center Community Advisory Board and the Center for Asian American Media. Now, Christine is the co-founder and executive director of Asian Pacific Islander American Vote, also known as APIAVote. Their mission is to work with local and state community-based organizations to mobilize Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in electoral and civic engagement. Since 2007, APIAVote has been building power in AAPI communities by investing in their capacity and infrastructure to mobilize voters. This investment, as well as proactively training and resourcing community leaders across the country, paid off in the 2020 election cycle and the recent census. Under Christine's leadership, APIAVote strengthened and expanded APIAVote's partners into 28 states and made two historical milestones. The first, they were able to attract then candidate Joe Biden to speak directly to the AAPI electorate, a first in the history for a presidential nominee. And second, they contributed to the groundwork that led to the highest AAPI voter turnout in history. So thank you, Christine, for joining us today or tonight for you, and for sharing with us trends about the AAPI voting community that the APIAVote survey has found. With that, I'd love to turn it over to you, and you are welcome to take the floor.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's actually quite ironic. I had noted earlier to the steering committee that more recently, it seems like there's been more and more interest and engagement from APIs abroad in terms of how they can actually get more engaged, because more recently I also did an event with the US consulate in Guangzhou as well. So the timing is really perfect. Right now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and since this is an intimate crowd, feel free to go ahead and inject any questions along the way. I may not necessarily be able to see the chat as well, but I'm gonna close out some of these things so I can see everything. So you may just need to just go ahead and maybe one of the moderators can go ahead and just unmute and just let me know if there's any particular questions as I'm going through these slides. So
Perfect.
I'm
Thank
going
you
to
for
go
that.
ahead and just go over some of the growing trends that we saw with the census, as well as how's that tied to the growing API electorate, and then also review some of the trends that we've been seeing since 2012, 2014, early on when we started doing our Asian American voter survey. So with that, I just want to go ahead and preface that APIAVote is a nonpartisan organization founded in 2007 with the whole idea that we want to increase civic engagement among Asian American Pacific Islanders. So we work with nonprofit organizations in over 28 states to help them build their capacity to do this work, as well every single year, as well as making sure that we get counted in the census every 10 years. Our basic philosophy is that all power is local. So all of our field work, all of our plans really need to hone in terms of what the community looks like at the local level, and what messaging and how they organize needs to be taken into consideration as well. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the demographic trends that we saw with the latest numbers that we saw from the 2020 census. So, you know, the API community, we've actually grown in double digits over the last 10 years in 49 states. It's essentially every single state except for Hawaii, where we're already a majority. So that's really important for us to remember, because nearly 1 in 4 Americans now identify them as either Hispanic or Asian. Also, for those who are younger, there's no racial or ethnic group for people younger than 18. So that's something to keep in mind as we're looking at how do we engage younger generations and what type of messaging actually will resonate with them. Also, Hispanics and Asians and people of 2 or more races are the only groups underage that are growing. So that's why another reason why we need to pay attention to this segment of our population. Even though we've heard how some states have gained congressional seats and how some have lost. So here you'll see this map where in red, those states are the ones that lost a congressional seat, and then those who are in green had actually gained a congressional seat. But remember, in all these states, we actually continue to grow in population. So there is an opportunity where the API electorate can actually be more of a important electorate that the political parties and the campaigns really need to pay attention to and to engage. Also, the top 10 states where APIs live, also recognizing that we actually 9 million people now identify as multiracial in 2010 to 33.8 million in 2020, which is an increase of 276%. So the challenge with that also is that because it is multiracial, we actually have to do different ways in terms of identifying Asian American and Pacific Islanders. Asian Americans are also in the top 3 largest ethnic groups in California, Hawaii, Massachusetts, and Washington. Here we actually have a list of the top 10 states where we have the largest percentage in each of these different states. The one I really want to focus on is Nevada. If you looked at 10 years ago, they were probably not on this list, but now they make up 13.1% of that particular state. So, you know, we need to keep an eye in terms of where these trends are, especially when you're looking at congressional seats and local and also other local races. This graphic actually focuses on the largest Asian origin groups by state. So I just want to point out, so like in the Midwest and the Southeast, the largest Asian origin group is actually Indian. A lot of people have not recognized that until recently. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, that's actually Hmong. But then, you know, here you have Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, which the largest groups are actually Chinese, as well as like California, Oregon, and Washington. Nevada, of course, is Filipino, but that also extends to Idaho and Montana, North and South Dakota. So these are just also another glimpse in terms of when you're looking at how we need to target different communities and understanding which are the largest origin groups by state. This is also another data chart in regards to the fastest growing ethnicities. So to also recognize that in the last 10 years, not only has our community has grown, but it also has become more diversified. So the fastest growing ethnicities include Nepalese, Burmese, Micronesian, Guamanian, and Chamorro. Also, the largest growing ethnicities by number is Indian, Chinese, Filipino, and Vietnamese. So the Vietnamese is also interesting to see because in the past, it used to be like Korean Americans as being one of the fastest largest ethnicities. So let's head into the trends of what we're seeing, how that translate into presidential elections and the API electorate. So for the longest time, I was always saying that when we first started APIAVote, when this was actually an idea back in 1996, and then we actually spun off as a standalone organization in 2007, we were dealing with the whole idea that our community was really pretty much registering and voting around the 30 to 35% percentage point. So it was really a minority of our community that was actually registered and voting. And we also recognized at that particular point in time that as more and more API institutions were coming into Washington, D.C. to represent the diverse API communities in enacting policies and advocating on different issues, we realized that APIAVote really need to build up its capacity and actually become a standalone organization to really focus on the need to continue to register and get out the vote, because we were not as powerful as our other communities, even though we had more of a presence throughout the decades doing advocacy work. But the problem was that our community was not registering and voting. Then for the longest time, I would say half of our family and friends were registering and voting. Even back heading into 2020, I kept telling everyone in all of our presentations that you might as well go into a room and assume that only half of your family and friends are ready to go ahead and vote on election day. Luckily, a lot of things did transpire in 2020, and we actually were able to register close to 64% and turn out by 59.7%. That's actually one of the largest turnout rates and registration rates. That was actually larger than any other ethnic community. So we actually did make a difference in 2020, and we actually got a lot of recognition for that because people were underestimating what the API community was going to be doing. And because of a number of reasons, everything from, the pandemic, the rise of anti-Asian violence, but also I think the investments that different funders had provided in the last 10 years really helped the API nonprofit community build up its capacity and build up to this moment in time where we were turning out the count for the census, at the same time turning out the vote for the 2020 elections. And because of everything that needed to be done and the multiple touch points that happened throughout 2020, it really gained momentum to November, where we ultimately saw this increase of voter registration and turnout within the Asian population. Here is another example in terms of seeing the ballots cast by Asians in recent elections. As you see, once again, the huge amount of turnout in 2020. And this is something that we actually want to go ahead and replicate. And the way we could do that is that studies have shown that if we could get people or voters to actually vote 3 times in a row, that actually turns them into a lifetime voter. So it's really been key for those who had local elections here in Virginia, in New Jersey, as well as other local elections that was happening nationwide this past November, and then heading into the 2022 elections where we're going to have elections all across the country this upcoming fall. Here's where I want to show where API's voters actually overperformed. Across the 49 states, people who had a vote history, in other words, they were voters coming into the 2020 cycle. What we saw is that 49.4% of API voters in 2020 did not vote in 2016. So they had more vote motivation in 2020. This is actually a lot higher when you compare to 31.9% among all other voters. Now, in terms of first-time voters across the 49 states, once again, that's first-time voters are those that have no vote history. So 23% of API voters were voting for the first time in comparison to 12.2%. So once again, there was a lot more motivation that we saw in terms of first-time voters, as well as those that have been previously registered, but for whatever reason decide not to vote back in 2016. The other trend that we saw is that APIs, 3 out of 4 Asians voted early or by mail. So that's close to 73%. That's actually we're the largest segment or racial base of voters that chose to vote early or by mail. We also overperformed in voting early in Georgia, Arizona, Texas, Michigan, and those are like key states where people were looking at that and trending and trying to figure out what the turnout was going to be, what the turnout was going to look like. Especially since this is an API Dem Caucus, the trends have shown that early voters tend to be Democratic voters. And so that was something that they were really excited to see, that Asians were turning out early as well. Another key finding that I want to note from the current population survey is about voting options. Now, in 2020, Asian Americans use vote by mail more than any other racial or ethnic group, as we noted that. And 73% of Asian American voters cast their ballot by mail specifically in 2020. Registration. So Asian Americans are also less likely to register at the DMV or at the registration office. So what we know is that they're more likely to register by mail and also online. And this is also very key in terms of how we actually conduct our voter registrations. We know it's still very important for us to have trusted messengers from our community going to the community and asking them and presenting options for them to register, or to get them to register immediately online as you're engaging with them. So this is very different from what you'll see from other voters, where they're going to go ahead and go to the DMV or the registration office. Now, even back in 2010, APIAVote noticed that the #1 reason why Asian Americans don't vote is that they're more likely to say that they're too busy to vote. And that continues to be a trend that we saw back in 2020, as well as them saying that they were concerned about the COVID-19 pandemic. So because of that, heading into 2020, I actually felt more comfortable that our community was going to vote early and by mail. And as you saw in the slides, that is what actually did transpire. The reason I felt more comfortable is because when you looked at the data, even early in 2020, if you look in California, Washington, and Oregon, where vote by mail is readily available, Asian American voters tend to use that option at a higher rate than most folks. And so we really believed, especially the last 10 years, we've been educating more of our community, knowing that they would always say that they were too busy to vote on election day. We were, for over a decade, have been educating them about vote by mail and early voting options. So that has always been included in all of our mailers, our scripts, our phone banking, text banking. Anytime we're engaging with the community, we are always incorporating that point in terms of helping them, making sure that they're able to cast their ballot and that they don't use that as an excuse. I also wanted to point out in 2020, this is a snapshot of the battleground states, and the top line is the margin of victory in 2020 presidential elections, and the second line is the number of APIs who voted in 2020. So as you can see, we really are a significant portion of the electorate that really needs to be told and as part of the narrative when we're talking about battleground states, and who actually is part of that electorate that really swung those states. And as we head into 2022, these same battleground states, I suspect, are going to be the same states that they're going to focus on in terms of statewide races, as well as congressional races as well. I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about the API Youth. So traditionally, APIs 18 to 24-year-olds have the lowest voter registration, voter engagement rate in comparison to other communities of color. But in 2020, we continue to actually go in the right direction. This actually started in 2018 and then carried over to 2020. As you see, 2016, Asians 18 to 24 voted at 38%, which is about 10% lower than the general Asian electorate. And then 2020, it was close to 56%, which is a great increase for us to see, but it still is lower than the general Asian population. In addition, we also saw that Asian voters, 18 to 24-year-olds, had the largest increase than any other communities, whether it's Black, Hispanic, multiracial, or white. But the thing is, even though we're increasing our participation, yet I want to go ahead and point out to the very last line where it says, despite those promising trajectories, Asian American students lag behind their white peers by 20 percentage points. So if we are to be at parity with the white community and other voters, we need to continue to increase voter registration and making sure that those that did vote continue to vote every single year and turn them really into lifetime voters in itself. Here you also see voting rates by sex, by race, and groupings. Here I just want to point out that Asian females are slightly doing a little bit better than Asian males when it comes to their voting rates as well. This particular data is actually comparing minority serving institutions and colleges to see what their voting rates look like. So all this youth data that we're looking at is actually the largest study of college and student populations on various college campuses across the country. And the one that we have circled here on the left-hand side is specifically about Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions. So here you saw, once again, there has been an increase of voter participation. And that's something that we want to continue to increase that for 2022. So looking ahead, we went ahead and looked at the Cook report this summer to take a look in terms of where we can make a difference in terms of governors' races across the country. What you see in terms of percentages on the right-hand side is the percent of API population in that particular state. So this is where, especially when we know that the elections are going to be very close, turning out the API electorate is really going to have to be key and part of the party and as well as the political campaigns when they're looking at their formulas. Now, the job of the API Caucus and others within the Democratic Party is that we're hoping that you will be able to use this data and uplift this within your political parties and infrastructure to making sure that they understand that we are an important part of this electorate and how we actually need to invest dollars and invest engagement in terms of the API electorate early on. I think that's been one of the problems that we saw in this 2021 election, especially in Virginia, is that there was not enough investments in terms of engaging API populations early on the Democratic side. In terms of the Senate, here's also another list of states where we can make a difference in the Senate. Nevada, Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. So a lot of these are similar, like I said, are similar regions that we looked at and engaged in back in 2020. Now, here is a chart in terms of, I just wanted to demonstrate as an example in terms of congressional races, how we really need to look at the data and how we need to understand how do we develop goals in terms of how do we increase voter registration and turnout of the API electorate. So right now, we really can't say until redistricting is finalized in each of the states to be able to understand what the congressional lines will look like, especially for states that are gaining congressional seats and those that are losing. So specifically, like we know and we believe that Orange County will continue to be a battleground region, especially where the API electorate is quite large. So here, I just wanted to demonstrate, if you take a look at the first two lines of the Orange County region, the first column is the margin of victory for that congressional race back in 2020. So that's really from 4,000 to 8,000 votes, right? Asian registered voters is the second column. And then the third column is the current Asian vote share in that particular congressional district. In those districts, the API vote is actually quite higher than the statewide Asian vote share, which you'll see in the next column. Now, we actually see next to it is the number of Asian voters who voted in 2020. But we also know what is who was actually eligible, and in reality, even though we did a great job in terms of turning out, we were still not meeting to our full potential. For those congressional seats, we were still minus 2.7% and minus 3.3% in terms of really being able to meet our potential. So to be able to do that heading into 2022, we recognize that ideally our job that we feel at APIAVote is that we need to go ahead and turn out the same number of APIs in that congressional district, but in addition, bring in about 11,000 or 12,000 more additional voters for that. And that's not even accounting the growth of the API community heading into the 2022 elections in itself. But this is an example in terms of what type of data and analysis that APIAVote typically undergoes when we're trying to decide what are our goals for the year and how we're going to meet that as we actually figure out state by state, city by city in terms of what needs to be done in terms of voter registration and voter turnout in itself. The last portion I want to go ahead and go over is the Asian American Voter Survey, which APIAVote had started back in 2012, but then we actually initiated it with API data from 2014 to 2020. This is a fall survey that gets conducted every 2 years. And we encourage you, for those of you who really like to read into the different research and polling, for you to go to our website and to actually be able to pull up all the webinars as well as the data points and PowerPoints for each of the different surveys. But what I'm going to go ahead and do today is actually go through some of the longitudinal trends that we've been seeing from 2014 through 2020. So overall, we've always had noted to both the Democrat and Republican Party throughout the years that they're really not doing enough in terms of engaging with the API community. Because every single survey, we always note and ask, like, how have you been contacted by the nonprofit community, by the Democrats or the Republicans? Now, Democrats have always traditionally have done a better job than any other group in terms of engaging with the API electorate, but it's still typically a lot lower in comparison to African-American, Latino, or women's groups, or the segments of those electorates. Now, what we're starting to see is that Republicans are continuing to outreach more and more, and they're trying to really catch up to make up for lost time. Back in 2013, Jeb Bush stated that Asian Americans are the canary in the coal mine, and that's when they started to invest dollars in terms of doing outreach to the API electorate. That's in comparison to the 1990s when the DNC had really first hired their API staff to conduct API outreach. And so with that, what we've seen here is a trend in terms of from our survey of what type of engagement those who were surveyed of in terms of what they saw in terms of engagement from the Democrat and Republican Party. Now, one thing we really want to note here, especially for this group, is that the Republican Party outreach is closing the gap in outreach to young adults 18 to 34. Also, in addition, when it comes to foreign-born, Republican Party has improved in naturalized citizen outreach, and in 2020 surpassed the levels of Democratic and community outreach. Now, the Democrats and also the nonprofit community are actually more successful in reaching out to US-born citizens. So there's a difference in terms of that. But that means like what the Democratic Party needs to think about is like, how do you actually increase your engagement with naturalized citizens? Does that mean working more with the Asian ethnic press? Does that mean making sure that you have more translated and culturally appropriate messaging and materials that actually engages that first generation immigrant. In terms of party identification, Democrats tend to do a lot better than Republicans. Overall, what I've always said is that Asian American voters typically do not like to be identified as progressive or conservative or Democrat or Republican. A lot of them like to still identify as independent. But for those that decide that they want to go ahead and identify with a political party, Democrats tend to win, actually are able to get 2-to-1 advantage over the Republicans in itself. Now, for Vietnamese and Filipino voters, that's where the Republican Party has had an advantage and increase over the 8-year period. Here you'll see in terms of red is where you'll see with the Vietnamese Party, Vietnamese American Party identification, it really has increased from 2016 through 2020. For the Filipino community, it really has increased really more so, I think, from 2018 to 2020. And then for the Chinese community, this has been interesting to see that they are now when you look at the Asian American Pacific Islander voters, they're the largest ethnic community that identified as independent. And so what we've seen also in terms of trends is that in 2020, they actually turned more independent and actually, I think a lot of it was because for those that were supportive of Trump back in 2016, they decide not necessarily to go toward the Democrats, but then they decide to actually at least identify themselves as an independent. So there are like different opportunities in terms of what we're seeing here. For Asian Indians, they're actually the largest segment that trend heavily Democratic in terms of party ID. Koreans also typically have been trending Democrat as well, but there are some segments where we're seeing in 2020 where the Republicans are gaining a little bit in terms of chipping that away from the independent voter. And all these slides will be made available to you as a PDF, so that way you could go ahead and look at this more closely as well. We also wanted to note in terms of social media and voter behavior, in terms of discussing politics with family and friends. You know, in the last 4 years, a number of young adults who talk to their family and friends about politics have actually significantly decreased, while the number engaging online about politics has stayed constant. So this is something that we actually want to like dive in a little bit deeper and try to research a little bit more, because we know that the API community has are heavily engaged online or, you know, in their daily lives, but how can we make sure that they discuss and are educated about politics in the same way? But it's really uneven in terms of by ethnicities, in terms of who actually talks about politics and what platforms that they actually use. Here, there was more data in terms of what you see around Facebook and Twitter, but I know that there's a lot more research that's being done in terms of how our communities are engaging on WeChat as well as WhatsApp in itself. And then last thing I wanted to go ahead and note is a little bit about narrative change. I want to, you know, really bring up the thought that the last 2 years during this pandemic, we've seen, because of the increase of anti-Asian violence, especially after the Atlanta shootings, that the mention of Asian Americans had actually increased, whether it's on social media, in the press, or here what you see is in terms of lawmakers, right? But the majority of all the discussion has always been centered around violence, discrimination, or racism. Even though our community has grown and we're significant in terms of the API electorate, and in reality, and on issues, especially on one example is economic inequality, we should be part of that discussion. We should be part of that narrative when the media and lawmakers are actually talking about this issues. So for this example, I've noted like Asian Americans have the highest poverty rate in New York City, but it's rarely ever mentioned, and we're rarely ever included when you're talking about economic inequality in the news or with our elected officials. Even in California, 83% of Asian Americans with high school degrees or less filed unemployment claims. So when we're talking about unemployment, we should also be part of that conversation. Now, what we've seen is that, Pew here has noted how our median income really varies among Asian origin groups. And there is a segment who does live in poverty, and that actually also needs to be uplifted. So that way, our community is really noted for all the different needs and the diversity that that is actually characteristic of our community in itself. This particular report from the Association of Asian Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy created this report called Invisible Ink Report, Media Representations of AAPIs. The first graphic that you see is the percentage of economic inequality articles with data on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So 28% of the time, APIs are actually included in the data. That's still very dismal, because that means almost 2/3 of the time, we are not part of the research, we are not part of the surveys. So that's another thing that we actually also need to focus on. We saw that in the beginning, even from the November elections. Initially, a lot of people were talking about the Black vote, Latino vote, but the API electorate was not necessarily mentioned in a lot of the news coverage. Also, the second data point here that you see, this chart on the bottom, is that even when API data is actually included and there is data on our community, we're actually 62.6% of that time. Actually, I'm sorry, API data, 37% of the time, we're actually excluded from actually presenting that data, even when it's actually available. So many times the media is actually not even utilizing the data that is actually available to them in itself. And then even looking at 2020, when we're looking at what are some of the key words when you're talking about the API communities, here you see for Asian Americans, it typically was Chinese or Andrew Yang or Harvard. For Pacific Islanders, it was about Moana and Disney or Hawaiian. So, what this really shows is that we're barely being included, and really, especially in terms of understanding the real deep different layers of the API community is really not represented in the media in itself. And that really does transcend in terms of how the API candidates and parties actually are viewing this particular community in itself. So I really wanted to just note that because even though as we're getting more and more data, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of educating our political parties, our elected officials, and the media in terms of what the API community looks like, what the issues we care about, and how does that actually gets impacted, especially now that we're passing laws and signing new initiatives and new federal programs. But how do we make sure that the API community is also being outreach properly and also addressed, and making sure that their needs are actually being provided. One other thing I want to go ahead and point out is some issues facing the API women. The National API Women's Forum had also conducted a survey back in 2020. 1 in 6 API women voted the first time in November, and even more so in Texas. So these are just some trends that we're seeing with API women, especially as we head into the 2022 cycles, where there's a lot of issues, including reproductive rights, that are going to be on the table in some of these states. And so I think engaging the API women and how we go about doing that is also going to be another strategy that we need to make sure that we dive in deep, and also we actually incorporate that into our strategies. And then lastly, I just want to go ahead and bring up, as we head into the 2022 cycle, I encourage all of you and the caucus to be able to participate in our civic holidays. This is an example of what the civic holidays looked like back in 2021, this past November. And this is actually a series of celebrations that we actually incorporate every single year, kicking it off with National Voter Registration Day at the end of September, and then leading into National Voter Education Week, Vote Early Day, and then Election Hero Day. And so this really is almost like a guideline in terms of helping each and every one of us understand what are the things that we need to help API voters focus on as we head into the election cycle in itself. So with that, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and then that way we could go ahead and open it up for Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. That was really informative, and I know we already have a few questions in the chat, so I will just jump to those first. Susan was asking, I mean, we kind of saw on the graphs these trends of some specific groups voting tending to be more conservative. And Susan quoted an article that was saying there's a growing trend, like in New York, towards conservative candidates. So do you have any thoughts about how we can address this, given GOP moving into the AAPI community and all the disinformation that's out there?
I mean, I think it goes back to, one, our community is voting earlier, right? And so that's why even more so, engagement really needs to start out earlier than just October. And relationship building also needs to start earlier, and also it needs to happen every single year and ongoing, right? And so those are type of investments that need to be had by the parties and the candidates, as well as the elected officials. We always say that, you know, for those in the community itself, we say election day is just the start. So right after election day, it's about holding these elected officials accountable, and that you need to go ahead and meet with them to make sure that they understand their issues and concerns. From your side, from the, you know, being a API caucus within the DNC, this is where you need to go ahead and try to push. And also I see Eric Salcedo, who is here with the DNC. You need to go ahead and give him the ammunition, so that way he could tell and work those internally, saying, hey, I'm hearing from the caucuses that we need to invest in XYZ, that they're not seeing XYZ being done, right? And so I think when we look at some of the trends of Democrats and Republicans that have done well and was able to win their elections in the last 4 years, it's because they had API staff members that were hired 6 or 7 months earlier. They started out with just relationship building. It wasn't a hard ask initially, because you have to really develop those type of relationships, right? And then it's also about those that were able to keep their seats are the ones that continue that relationship after the election in itself.
Another question is from Omar, and he was asking if you could provide some information on why Filipinos and Vietnamese are trending more Republican.
That's something that we've seen the last 10 years. Back in 2008, when Obama had won his first election, we started to see that Vietnamese Americans were starting to trend a little bit more Democrats, but they still had a lot more to move. What we're seeing is that younger Vietnamese Americans tend to be more progressive. But, you know, we also saw that there's a lot more dis and misinformation happening in Orange County. So that's also another factor that could also play into that. For a Filipino community, a lot of that is, a lot of those voters are going to be single voter, like a focus on single issue, and that tends to be around abortion. And so that's where it really varies. And I think that's where you have to really segment different populations and age ranges. Filipino Americans younger are going to be a little bit more progressive as well. So what your messaging may be with 18 to 24-year-olds in those communities may be different from those that are older as well.
And then kind of bouncing off of that, I mean, being also made the point that Filipino Americans tend to vote Democratic in presidential elections, but then Republican in local and state. I don't know if you can say anything on that, or why they tend to then make that distinction.
Well, I think that's overall the API community that, once again, I had pointed out, they don't like to label themselves with a particular party. And that's why it goes back to their relationship with the candidate in itself. So so we've seen where a lot of API voters are splitting their ticket, right? They may vote for the Democratic presidential nominee, but then down ticket, they may go ahead and vote for the Republican, or it may be also vice versa as well.
And then going back to the graph that you had with like the representative races in like Orange County, for example, just to, I guess, clarify, you're making an assumption, or you're hoping that voter turnout will remain the same as in 2020 in 2022, correct? Or are you factoring in that it's likely that it will go down, as usually in midterm years?
It usually is lower, but we're still hoping that we're able to continue to, since we've been building up the capacity and the interest, that we will still be able to increase our participation rate higher than other midterm elections in itself. And we already saw that with the 2021 elections, even though we don't have all the data in, but at least in terms of early voting, API early vote numbers were extraordinarily high in comparison to 2017.
Oh, that's good. One thing I was curious about is, with having, more AAPI representation in actual political positions. So for example, with Michelle Wu winning in Boston, do you think that kind of thing will also help turn out the vote, or will help motivate people to want to vote more than in the past when they see themselves in the representatives?
I mean, studies have shown that when we have more API candidates, because as a candidate, the first thing you're going to do is engage your own family and friends, right? And so they typically increase voter participation, as well as when they're outreaching for fundraising, they're able to educate more folks within their own networks about the election. And so there is an impact in terms of having more elective candidates as well as elected officials. I think it's amazing to really see not only Michelle Wu, but APIAVote and Bruce Harrell from Cincinnati and Seattle also win their mayoral races. And I also want to point out that a lot of these folks are career, they've actually been running as candidates and have been a public servant for over a decade. So it's not like these people just came out of the blue, and that we've really been increasing that bench, but we still need to do a lot more in terms of being able to catch up in terms of meeting how large our community is. We still have a lot more that we need to inspire to actually get them to actually go ahead and run as candidates and win their elections in itself.
And then kind of bouncing off of that, I wanted to ask too, like with, in 2020, like you said, there were a lot of factors that helped get out the vote, especially with the anti-Asian hate that was going on, that had been fueled by the past administration. And I was just wondering, moving ahead, if you think that will still continue to be a factor for people, or if that's, maybe kind of dying off in a sense for some people, and it is no longer at the forefront as a concern.
I think it's still capturing a little bit of our attention, but ultimately right now, because everyone's, I think, overall fatigue from this pandemic, is that everyone just wants solutions. So I think moving forward, and also I think the API community is very pragmatic as well. So they're going to want to find candidates that are going to be able to find a solution and also deliver. So I think there's going to be a lot of people are going to be looking in the next, 11 months to see what the different political parties are going to be doing and who's really going to be able to deliver heading into 2022.
We have a question from America. She was wondering, how effective is nonpartisan outreach via faith communities? She mentioned that she had a meeting with an interdenominational organizer in Dallas, and they didn't really have any templates. So how are these communities being reached through other voter rights groups?
I will say that the API religious community has not necessarily been um, as tapped into as of yet. I know for the most part, a lot of our community-based organizations that we work with are not necessarily religious based. We have been working with the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund. So they're trying to do a lot more work in terms of incorporating voter registration and voter awareness with the Gordoras. But there's still a lot more that needs to be done. I know in the Korean community, there's been discussions about how can we go ahead and, because there's so much structure around religion for that community, how can we go ahead and do that? But that goes back to that we need to identify trusted community leaders in that religious space and first convince them that one, they are allowed to do this type of work, and how do you do it in a nonpartisan manner so that way we can at least get them registered and engaged. It's very different from the African American community. The awareness and understanding is just still not there yet. So I welcome if anyone has leads in terms of those type of individuals. We're always open to onboarding and working with more nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations in terms of doing this work.
And then another question from Omar. He was wondering if APIAVote has done any surveys by Asian American groupings, so specifically about Filipinos, Indians, identifying what issues are most important to each of these groups, and if those issues are correlated with income levels or residential level locations, so urban versus rural, high income versus lower income, and then if so, what kind of findings have you found?
So this is what's called the limitations of resources. So back in 2012, we realized that we were not part of the narrative and investments were not being made into the API community because everyone kept saying that, well, there's no data about the API electorate. So we went ahead and just, raised our own money and started to at least have our Asian American voter survey that is conducted every 2 years. This survey is really a national survey of about 1,200 or 1,300 individuals, depending on the year. It's really the top 6 largest Asian populations. So it's not even AAPI, just the top 6. It is in language, at least in Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Japanese, and Tagalog. And but we don't have a large enough sample to be able to say in a particular state. The National Asian American Survey, which was done by a number of academics, which has a larger base of voters, they have some data, but the last survey that they conducted, I think, was in 2016. And they also ran out of funding, so it actually did not continue in 2020. For whoever is interested in learning more about at least overall trends with the different Asian ethnic communities, at least the top 6, and what issues resonate with them, that is on our website at the apiavote.org/research. So you could go ahead and take a look at the 2020 survey to dig in a little bit deeper on that. What we've seen is that overall, API voters, in terms of issues, they actually are quite progressive in terms of how they stand on issues, even on affirmative action, where those that have been getting the attention of the media, you would think that there's a larger segment that are anti-affirmative action, but throughout the years, our survey data has continued to show that APIs are by majority are still supportive of affirmative action. And so that's where you could really dig in a lot deeper in terms of our survey data and see that as well.
And then I guess my final question before we kind of move into our larger group discussion, you mentioned, we're redistricting right now. We've got the census data, depending on who's in charge of redistricting, they see that AAPIs turned out a lot more. Do you think that that will have any influence moving forward, the AAPI specific voter turnout and how they approach redistricting, any potential gerrymandering in regards to that?
this is what we're seeing is it's really different state by state. And that's why we're right now, APIAVote, we've been conducting regional state specific redistricting trainings in 12 different locations, trying to get our community to testify. Others are, working with coalitions with other communities of color, communities of interest to really weigh in on those redistricting lines. What we're starting to see is that there are some disturbing trends. So for instance, some of the maps in Seattle, Washington, the area where there's a large API population is called the International District. I've been told that some of the maps they're looking at dividing up and carving out the ID and putting them into other districts that have, with people that currently who are elected officials who don't necessarily have the same ties into the community. Southern California, California has lost a congressional district. We see that it probably will happen. It will probably come out of Southern California. So there are shifting in terms of like Monterey and the I-10 area. How's that going to be broken up into? We believe what I've been told is that some of the maps being presented is that they are actually also taking segments of the Asian population and moving it to other districts. So these are things that we need to take a look at, that people need to be more involved with. But at the same time, it can't just necessarily be focused just on race. We also have to look at other factors in terms of how do you identify communities of interest when you're actually working on redistricting.
Great. So I think with that, I will go ahead and stop the recording and then also now turn it over to Corey.